So yes, Joanna, again, thank you for coming.
Thank you so much for having me.
So again, without further ado, maybe we should directly go to the heart of the matter. But when I say heart of the matter, I don't mean directly international economic law right away. I think it's also important to contextualize it a little bit, maybe from taking a step back. I want to talk a little bit about the current global trends that also affect international economic law and policymaking and relations more broadly. And when I say that, maybe more specifically, I mean the global rise in populist tendencies in international politics, in domestic politics, and the interaction between the two. This, in a way, from what I can observe, manifested twofold. There is a group, there are the proponents or the champions of globalization, and those that, in connection with this rising populism, those that are more in favor of an anti-globalist or more reflexive, if you will, camp. So how do you think this came to be? What do you consider the causes of this to be, this divide, this grand dichotomy, if you will? And what kind of rationale or lack of rationale, if you will, played a role in establishing this friction that we are experiencing today in international economic relations?
Well, this is a really big question to address, and I think it's extremely complex. Something that we can, I guess, easily or safely say is that over the past number of years, we have witnessed more and more resistance towards transnational structures.
Yeah.
Or something that, following Lyotard's concepts, we could call like grand narratives.
Mm-hmm.
And in a legal sense, that would be grand narratives of multilateral legal order, of regional initiatives such as the European integration. And we've seen more and more, I guess, political forces that have been opposing those trends. So if the 1990s, the early 2000s were the decades of still optimism related to possibility of upkeeping institutions of global economic governance, and not just economic governance, generally grand multilateral structures or grand regional structures like the European Union. I think in a number of countries we have seen much discontent with what those structures have brought. Sometimes the discontent is just ascribed to the structures, whereas the causes might lie elsewhere. And quite recently, when we had the inauguration of SHIELD, the research group that you have mentioned, and we had a lecture offered by Professor Anne van Aken from Hamburg, the director of the Institute of Law and Economics at the University of Hamburg. She was actually explaining how the former theories, former popular economic models, such as the theory of rational choice, are not really able to capture in its entirety the causes for those phenomena. Nevertheless, like all around the globe, in countries ranging from Brazil through the United States to Central Eastern Europe and Southern Europe as well, we see the rise of populism. But those tendencies, they pop up not only in the countries that might have the problem with the rule of law. I think the United States provide an example. But we also have populist movements like rising in significance in other states, traditional democratic states.
Yeah, I mean, it's more with the caveat, I don't want to point any fingers or maybe speak about any country in specific, but U.S. is a very unique example in the way, especially in the context of Professor van Aken's talk, where I was there also, and throughout her talk, I was under the impression that maybe she gives too much credit that people will always act rationally. That maybe she has too much faith. I know it sounds maybe it's better to be like that than be overly cynical about people. But don't you think that also in economic terms, more calculable, measurable terms, isn't it defy economic rationality in many ways that people don't only do things that might be subjectively irrational, or some group might think that something is irrational, but isn't it also in a way, can we simply assume, maybe sort of making you reflect on what Van Aken said, can we assume that people will act rationally, or rather, what would be the more realistic way to sort of approach, to understand exactly what's happening? Because through the normal channels, we are unable to understand or get the whole picture. So what do you think, just doesn't have to be obviously a very technical answer, just to get a reaction out of you, what do you think is the missing element that's preventing us from understanding what's happening?
Well, I believe that political choices might have many different causes, and economic calculation is not the only one, or not the only factor that might affect them.
Yeah.
So political choices might result from frustration, or they might be the choices against rather than for a certain solution. I believe that it also shows in the trade wars, in one of those like hot topics that have really ignited the public opinion over the past 2 years.
Yeah.
Actually, while the trade war was initiated by the current American administration, by the current U.S. government, it actually hit the hardest the American producers. It was actually the American farmers that suffered the most, as precisely the economic data demonstrate, and they form a large part of President Trump's constituency. So it has become actually a problem for President Trump right now, which some commentators are stating might have been one of the causes for cutting the deal with China related to easing up and actually like hampering the progress of this conflict.
Yeah.
So, in other words, I believe the reasons why people make political choices that further affect economy are not necessarily related to calculation of possible benefits and losses in economic terms.
Yeah. Yeah. Taking a step back now, because you mentioned the death of a grand narrative. What exactly do you think is the grand narrative that is dying here, and what is it being replaced with? Is it just another grand narrative that's replacing the old one? What is, or more concretely, what do you believe is the actual alternative right now that is being presented to this multilateralism as a grand narrative? Is it the bilateralism? Is it a complete anti-globalism so as to minimize the relationships and turn inside, like as the Trump administration has been pushing, America first? Should it be Sweden first and Denmark first? Or are we heading towards a different understanding of globalization, more based on a bilateral system rather than a multilateral system?
Well, I would wish for the latter. Regarding the original use of the term grand narrative by Lyotard, he was saying that the grand narratives tend to be, like in our times, well, of course, it was like late 1970s, but what he was envisioning was the replacement of the grand narrative by a number of scattered, locally embedded ones. And that, I understand, would reflect this first option that you are describing. There are definitely many forces that would push in that direction. But I think that it has its limitations. And I also think that announcing, for instance, the death of the grand narrative of the WTO is actually premature. The agreements are still in place. The effective debilitation of the WTO appellate body by obstruction of the appointments of the new judges, which has been the policy of the U.S. government over the past few years, has led to a stall, to a crisis, like definitely very serious crisis of the mechanism of dispute resolution here. But it doesn't mean that that the entire structure has been rendered completely useless.
Yeah.
And there are efforts made by different countries in order to find the way out of the impasse.
Yeah.
But there are also efforts that are made by the American government itself to push the WTO in the direction that they would desire to achieve. This can be seen in the initiatives that are like American solely, like this recent draft proposal for the decision of the WTO in order to expand the definition of prohibited subsidies, and in order to declare that the market conditions for the economies of the WTO members are what the organization supports and promotes. But this can also be seen in the alliances that are being forged. For instance, there's been a common declaration by the representatives of trade of the United States, Japan, and the European Union earlier this year, related to the redefinition of the prohibited subsidies under the WTO agreements. So we see those efforts, and I believe the alliances in one area might not might coincide with the conflicts in others. So it might be so that the European Union is coming as a staunch critic of the practice of the American government to obstruct the appointments of the WTO appellate body members. But on the other hand, the common interests related, for instance, to some practices that are adopted by China in relation to subsidization of its enterprises, might be the reason for having a common front. Still.
Well, you actually mentioned already parts of it, but you briefly mentioned the shortcomings in the international, or rather, I'm just trying to rephrase it in a way that we can eventually link it back to international economic law and policy making. And there are quite a lot of shortcomings, to put it simply. Now, it's also, I think, an unprecedented public scrutiny that on international economic law and its instruments and its different manifestations like investment law, trade law, WTO more specifically. And each of them share some problems, some shortcomings, but also each of them are universes, if you will, on their own right, that they have their own pros and own cons and own shortcomings, things to be fixed, and they all require familiarity specifically with these fields individually. So in a way, economic law is never just economic law. It's always something deeper, and there are more stakes, there are more interests at stake. Nothing is only economic and cannot be resolved within an economic framework, at least from where I stand. So on this reflection that you are obviously entitled to disagree with or agree with, but how do we address these shortcomings? How do we address the shortcomings currently perceived in the WTO system, in its dispute settlement body? How do we deal and cope with the issues that come up within the context of investor-state dispute settlement, for instance? There's already a reform process going in the UNCITRAL Working Group 3, so there are already things that are being done. So, as you are highly familiar and your research is embedded in these reform processes as well, I want to ask your opinion. What does the terrain, what does the landscape look like in terms of how the world is trying to cope and reform and readjust these mechanisms? And I will follow up later on your answer. I don't want to talk more.
Well, it's a very interestingly put question, because I believe that the efforts to reform the investor-state dispute resolution actually tend to contradict the thesis that multilateralism as the idea and as the way of handling international economic law is inefficient.
Yeah.
So, like easy transfer of experiences from the trade law and from the multilateral forum there and from the WTO onto the investment sphere is impossible, I believe, because when it comes to investor-state dispute resolution, our starting point is the opposite. We have like quite a scattered landscape of multiple bilateral investment treaties and free trade agreements that contain investment provisions. It's extremely complex and it's counted in hundreds. And then we have a number of separate dispute resolution mechanisms embedded in each of those treaties, and this usually rely on investor-state arbitration. And then what we have seen over the past, I believe 15 years maybe in high intensity, has been the criticism, like public criticism of ISDS, the investor-state dispute settlement, as the mechanism. And attempts to promote a reform thereof. And what is a new thing is that actually relatively recently it has been undertaken by the multilateral forum, which is the United Nations and Untittled. So we have this. I'm not sure if everybody here is familiar with Untittled. Untittled is this commission of the United Nations that specializes in harmonization of international trade law. It has existed since the 1960s, and it has this. It operates through working groups, and the working group 3 has been endowed with a mandate to actually
reform
investor-state arbitration.
Well, so. Your emphasis is on the fragmented nature, so let me push back a little bit. Do you think the reform in ISDS or investor-state dispute settlement, do you think we're headed towards more multilateralism? Or a little bit more specifically, do you believe that the current multilateral investment court proposal that is being proposed by the European Commission, do you think it has a future at any degree of multilateralism or any degree, like, will there be at least a trilateral investment court? Do you think, maybe the bottom line, do you believe that we can resolve the issues that come from this fragmentation, which attracted criticism in itself? Do you think multilateralism at some degree is the solution to these problems, or do they need some other more supplemental considerations in addition to whether it's bilateral or multilateral? What kind of treats should multilateralism bring, in other words, for this transformation to be meaningful?
Well, this is the question about the nature of international courts and whether they bring about a genuine change when it comes to introducing a consolidated case law, more transparency, more public accountability. Because these were the points of criticism raised against ISDS, raised against the investor-state arbitration. That we have some clandestine tribunals nobody knows about, big corporations, international or multinational enterprises are cutting some deals with the governments, and nobody even knows about it. And the critics of investor-state arbitration have raised those arguments for years. And the separate question is whether what is being proposed right now is sufficient to address those concerns.
Exactly.
And this is a bit complicated, because the most prominent proposal right now comes from the European Union. It's called the Investment Court System, or the ICS. And what should be said, I believe, is that the European Commission has succeeded much more than many people expected in actually pushing forward for the adoption of this mechanism, which is similar to a court, it bears the name of the court or this investment court system. I know that the question also comes from our common experience of scratching a little bit under the surface and checking out what those ICS provisions in different treaties in which they are included actually bring. I know that our common opinion is that it's actually not that much more than arbitration has been. It's a bit like relabeling the same old solutions to make them more presentable to the for the needs of the current public opinion. In terms of transparency, in terms of third-party participation, there is a value in, I believe, in spelling out the standards. But it doesn't mean that those standards couldn't have been implemented by arbitral tribunals before. And they have also been available under the ancestral transparency rules. So in other words, I know that it's not just our isolated opinion. It's actually the perception of many commentators that ICS, it's not a very radical proposal. It's more in the name than, it's court more in the name than in nature. It's actually a hybrid mechanism. And it is still, it seems that it is still too radical for many states that belong to ancestral, because if we now move the discussion, shift the discussion from the EU and partners who are treaty partners to the multilateral forum where this investment court system proposal is brought on the table and proposed as a potential like basis for a multilateral solution for a truly international court, it is still too much for many countries to agree to.
Yes, it definitely is. I mean, I'm as you know, I'm an observer right now at the Working Group 3, and the campings are very interesting in many ways, that you see members teaming up that you wouldn't assume from the outset. It's much more tricky, and changing gears a little bit. The last two issues before we talk about Shield is that I want to ask you, because this is also a part of your and my as well research. I want to ask you about China. Why is China currently, in the current state of affairs, why is China a key actor, a key influence, and arguably a key challenge in international economic law and its making? Is it just that it's simply too big to fail, if you will, or is it this fundamental change in its identity as a rule taker to a rule maker? And also this goes hand to hand with this so-called capital importing country slowly transforming into a capital exporting country with huge investments overseas. What are your reflections about China in general and its role and the role that it's fulfilling?
I think it's all those factors that you mentioned, definitely. So it is this exponential growth of the Chinese economy since the 1970s, basically, that has led to its assumption of the role of the key global actor. So the actor that you cannot simply ignore. And it is also an actor that is, this is the object of much debate right now, actually, and both in the context of trade law and investment law, that it is not really a market economy. No. So we have an extremely significant actor with a huge trade exchange, with major investment ventures in different parts of the globe, including this extremely ambitious Belt and Road Initiative that covers like half of the world population, and which is, as some authors have dubbed it, like the new Marshall Plan without the war. So in terms of ambitions, in terms of size, it covers 3 continents and numerous countries. bringing about major infrastructure investments driven by China.
Yeah.
So we have at least cross-regional, maybe global ambitions of this major player. It is a player that is not a market economy in the sense as we are used to associate the connotation therewith. Which is again like this object of the controversy that I mentioned earlier on with the EU, United States, and Japan trying to push the multilateral forum towards being like more proactive in promoting market standards. So from the point of view of the EU, here as we speak about it being in Europe and being in Denmark, we can see that the perception in the EU or awareness of the EU of the significance of China and the ambitions of China has also changed.
Yeah.
So we've seen it, for instance, last year after the meeting of the leaders of both the European Union and China, and we've seen it in the official communications where China was actually named by the EU leaders, labeled as trade partner, but also competitor.
Yeah, I was actually going to follow up with a question regarding the EU and Denmark. You have already answered this in terms of China, but what about everything else that we talked? Oh, the influence of the US with the current administration, the internal frictions, let's say, with of the EU. Why do we care about all that is happening in the world, in the EU and in Denmark? Or how does it affect this particular geography, let's say? What in your opinion stands out, and other than China, and in what ways can Denmark, maybe with an emphasis on the sectors and the markets that are developing here, such as renewable energy, how exactly does this vista affects Denmark?
Well, of course, you can ask like, why here in Denmark, in this nice place, why do we care about some trade wars happening far away between two big global actors, and we're on neither of the sides, and why should we be bothered by it? Actually, there are some economists who, in the rise of the trade war in 2018, were coming up with the models that were showing that the EU should actually be quite content with that, because due to trade diversion, we would actually benefit from us being the source of substitute exports to both China and the US if they are not purchasing from each other anymore due to the raised tariffs. Yeah. This is a very short-sighted view, I would say, for a number of reasons. So trade wars affect us as well. If we have a policy, if we have this realpolitik in trade matters that allows for using a club or instead of more like finer instruments of correcting the course, the club can be used not only against a single actor, it can be used against the others. And this has been present to some extent at the Davos summit very recently, where it was suggested by President Trump that the EU might be actually the next target of the use of tariffs in the manner that has been practiced with China before. So that's like a specific way in which we might get affected. But we also get affected in a more general way, in the sense that we haven't really benefited as much from the trade war between US and China as was expected. The countries that benefited the most were, as far as I remember, countries like Vietnam or Chile or Indonesia.
Vietnam in particular, it's curious.
Yes, it attracted really a lot of investment that
escaped from China.
That would have been
targeted,
normally located in China. I don't think that the EU was that
No.
attractive as the source of substitute.
Joanna, thank you very much. This is all I have. Thank you for this very thought-provoking and insightful talk, and thank you for remarks. Please join me thanking Joanna.
Thank you so much. It's been such a great pleasure. Thank you.